The glass shattered 3 inches from Mara's face. She didn't flinch, hadn't for years. Just kept wiping down the counter with the same methodical circles she'd been making since she was 12 years old, ignoring the whiskey dripping down the wall behind her and the laughter erupting from the poker table in the corner. "Sorry, darling." One of the Carson brothers, she could never tell them apart when they were drunk, which was always, raised his empty glass in mock apology. Hand slipped. More laughter, the kind that wasn't really about the broken glass at all. Mara's father didn't even look up from the ledger he was pretending to read. Vernon Vance had mastered the art of selective blindness years ago, right around the time he'd realized his eldest daughter would work twice as hard as any hired hand and never ask for wages. "Mara." Her sister's voice cut through the saloon's perpetual haze of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies. "You missed a spot." Caroline stood in the doorway leading to the back rooms, wearing a dress that cost more than Mara had seen in cash in 5 years. Pale blue silk that matched her eyes, cinched at a waist, Mara knew for a fact was achieved through bindings so tight Caroline sometimes passed out in the outhouse. Her blonde hair was pinned in an elaborate style that had taken their mother 2 hours to arrange that morning. The engagement party. Right. Mara had almost forgotten, which was impressive considering the entire saloon had been scrubbed, decorated, and transformed for the occasion. Almost forgotten that tonight was the night her younger sister would officially become Mrs. James Hartley, future owner of the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. "I'll get it," Mara said, her voice carrying all the emotion of someone commenting on the weather. She bent to sweep up the glass, her brown hair falling forward to hide her face. It was easier that way. Easier to be invisible when you didn't have to watch their eyes slide past you, like you were part of the furniture. The thing about being invisible was that it happened slowly, not all at once, like in those fairy tales where a witch waves her hand and you disappear. No, it was a gradual erasure, 1,000 small moments where people looked through you instead of at you, where your father asked your sister's opinion, but never yours, where men bellied up to the bar and called you girl, even though you were 26 years old, where your own mother introduced you as my daughter who helps around the saloon, while Caroline was always my beautiful Caroline. Mara had been 17 when she'd realized she was disappearing, 20 when she'd stopped fighting it, 26 when she'd perfected it. "Mara, for Christ's sake," Christ's. Her mother appeared beside Caroline, a vision in burgundy taffeta that strained against her corseted middle. Martha Vance had been beautiful once, before the frontier had weathered her down to hard lines and harder words. "Go change into something presentable. Guests will be arriving within the hour." "I'm working." "Your father can manage the bar for one evening. This is your sister's engagement party." "Then she should be the one serving drinks, not me." The words came out before Mara could stop them. She knew immediately it was a mistake. Caroline's blue eyes went wide with theatrical hurt, and Martha's face did that thing where it turned to stone. "How dare you?" Her mother's voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than shouting. "After everything we've done for you, everything you've done for me?" The broom handle cracked under Mara's grip. "I've worked in this saloon every day for 14 years. I cook, clean, serve, keep the books when father's too drunk to read his own handwriting. I've never asked for anything, because you have nothing to offer." Martha's composure shattered like the whiskey glass. "Look at you. Plain as a fence post, built like a boy, skin dark as an Indian from all that time in the sun you insist on. Your sister has made something of herself despite her circumstances. The least you could do is show some grace." The thing about being slapped with words instead of hands was that there were no marks, no bruises to point to later and say, "Look, this is where it hurt." Mara set down the broom very carefully, uncurled her fingers from the handle one by one. "I'll change," she said. She walked past her mother and sister through the narrow hallway that smelled of old beer and older secrets, up the stairs to the tiny room she'd shared with Caroline until her sister had been given the larger room overlooking the street. "More appropriate for a young lady of her standing," her father had said. Mara's room was barely bigger than a closet. A cot, a washstand, a trunk that held everything she owned. She'd stopped decorating years ago, stopped hanging pictures or keeping flowers on the windowsill. What was the point of making a cage pretty? She pulled off her work dress, rough cotton, permanently stained despite her best efforts, and stood in her chemise, staring at the only other dress she owned. Gray wool, high-necked, long-sleeved. Appropriate for a funeral or a woman trying to disappear. From downstairs, she could hear the sounds of the party beginning. Voices, laughter, the slightly out-of-tune piano someone had hauled in from Ridgeway. Her father's booming greeting. Caroline's delighted squeal. Mara pulled the dress over her head and buttoned it with mechanical precision, smoothed her hair back into its usual severe knot, looked at herself in the cracked mirror above the washstand. A stranger looked back. Thin face, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that held nothing. Her mother was right about one thing. The sun had turned her skin a shade darker than was fashionable. Not that Mara had ever been fashionable. She was built, narrow and tall, with none of Caroline's soft curves. Her hands were rough, nails broken and stained. The hands of someone who worked. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman the world had decided didn't matter. The party was in full swing by the time she made it back downstairs. The saloon had been transformed with bunting and candles, tables pushed back to create space for dancing. The usual clientele had been replaced by Ridgeway's finest, or at least its wealthiest. Ranchers in their best suits, their wives in dresses that looked ridiculous against the saloon's rough-hewn walls, their daughters sizing up the available men with calculating eyes. And in the center of it all, Caroline and James Hartley, dancing to the struggling piano like they were the only two people in the world. Mara had to admit, they made a striking couple. Caroline with her golden beauty, James with his easy charm and handsome face. He was saying something that made Caroline laugh, her head thrown back, one hand pressed to her chest in that way she'd practiced in the mirror. Beautiful, isn't she? Mara turned to find Mrs. Hartley standing beside her, a champagne glass in her jeweled hand. James's mother was a formidable woman, all sharp edges and sharper observations. Yes, Mara said, because what else was there to say? My son is quite taken with her. Mrs. Hartley's eyes never left the dancing couple. Though I'll admit, when he first expressed interest in the Vance girls, I assumed he meant the elder daughter. Mara's stomach dropped. After all, Mrs. Hartley continued, swirling her champagne, you're the one who actually runs this establishment, aren't you? I've seen you work. Efficient, capable, not afraid to get your hands dirty. Those are admirable qualities in a wife. I'm sure Caroline will make James very happy. Oh, I'm sure she'll try. Mrs. Hartley took a delicate sip. Pretty girls always do, but pretty fades, dear. Competence endures. She glided away, leaving Mara standing there with words that felt like they might actually be kind, but somehow hurt worse than her mother's cruelty. The evening crawled forward. Mara fetched drinks, cleared plates, smiled until her face ached. She watched Caroline accept congratulations with practiced grace, watched James play the devoted fiancé, watched her parents bask in reflected glory. It was nearly midnight when she overheard the conversation that changed everything. She was in the back hallway, carrying a tray of dirty glasses, when she heard James's voice from the small room her father used as an office. Not that I don't appreciate the gesture, sir, but I'm not sure it's necessary. Nonsense, Vernon Vance's words were slurred. He'd been drinking his own whiskey all night. You're taking Caroline off our hands. Least I can do is offer you a proper dowry. The thing is, James hesitated, your other daughter. Mara, is it? She runs the saloon operations? Keeps the books, yeah, girl's got a head for numbers. I was wondering if she might be willing to continue that work after the wedding. Caroline's made it clear she has no interest in business matters, and frankly, I could use someone with Mara's organizational skills. The ranch accounts are a mess. You want to hire Mara? As a manager, yes. I'd pay her, of course, fair wages. There was a long pause. Then Vernon laughed, the sound wet and ugly. You want to pay her to do the same work she does here for free? Hell, boy. Take her. One less mouth to feed. I'll need to discuss it with Caroline first, naturally. Caroline won't mind. Never paid much attention to her sister anyway. They were never close. Never close. As if that explained everything. As if it wasn't Martha who'd pitted them against each other from childhood. Caroline, the pretty one. Mara, the useful one. Caroline, who got music lessons and new dresses. Mara, who got chores and criticism. Mara set down the tray very carefully so the glasses wouldn't rattle. Her hands were shaking. She walked through the back door into the cold night air and kept walking. Behind the saloon was nothing but scrubland and darkness, the kind of empty that swallowed sound. She walked until the noise of the party was just a distant murmur, until the only light was the stars overhead, cold and indifferent. One less mouth to feed. 26 years, and that's what she was worth. Not even worth keeping around for free labor. Worth less than the cost of feeding her. Something inside Mara's chest cracked. Not broke. She'd been broken for years. This was different. This was the moment when all the tiny fractures finally connected, when the structure she'd built to hold herself together just stopped. She didn't cry. Hadn't cried in years. Instead, she sat down in the dirt in her good gray dress and laughed. The sound scared up something in the darkness, a rabbit maybe, or a nightbird. And then there was just silence, and Mara, and the realization that she had become so thoroughly nothing that her own father was eager to give her away. She might have sat there all night if she hadn't noticed the light in the window. Old Man Jessup's general store was technically closed, but the lamp was burning in the back room where he lived. Mara stood, brushed off her dress, and walked across the dark street. The store's front door was locked, but she knew Jessup slept light. She knocked until she heard shuffling inside. "We're closed," came the querulous voice. "It's Mara Vance. I need something." A pause. Then the bolt scraped, and the door opened a crack. Jessup peered out, his white hair standing up in tufts. "Mara, it's past midnight. I need to see your contract board." "The what?" "I know you keep correspondence. Letters. I've seen people posting them." Jessup's face did something complicated. "Those aren't for general viewing, Pete. Please." Maybe it was her voice. Maybe it was the way she was standing there in her funeral dress with dirt on the hem. Maybe Jessup was just old enough to recognize desperation when he saw it. He opened the door wider. "Come in." The contract board was exactly what Mara had half remembered from the time she'd delivered messages for her father. A corkboard covered in papers, advertisements, notices, and yes, marriage contracts. Men from territories where women were scarce, offering land and home in exchange for a wife willing to brave the frontier. Most were obviously hopeless. Men who couldn't spell, offering nothing but hard work and probable death. But there was one. That one. Mara pointed to a notice written in careful, precise handwriting. "How long has it been up?" 6 months, near about." Jessup adjusted his spectacles. "Nobody's answered it. Can't imagine why. Man's got a section of land, house, cattle operation. Not many single men can offer that much." "Why hasn't anyone answered?" Jessup was quiet for a moment. "Territory he's in has a reputation. Brutal country, drought, flash floods, Comanche raids until a few years back. And the man himself?" He shrugged. "Heard he's hard. Doesn't talk much. Some say his first wife ran off, others say she died. Either way, folks are nervous." Mara read the notice again. "Rancher, 34, seeks wife for legal partnership and household management. Section 640 acres, established operation, house requiring repair. Prefer woman of practical nature, good health, willing to work. No romantic expectations. Contract negotiable. Direct correspondence to Elias Rook, care of Territorial Land Office, Socorro County. No romantic expectations." Those 3 words settled something in Mara's chest. "I want to answer it," she said. "Now, Mara, I can pay for paper and postage. I have some money saved." $3.40 hidden in the hem of her mattress. The sum total of what she'd managed to keep from the occasional tip over the years. "It's not about the money. That's a hard territory. Harder, man, from what I hear." "Harder than staying here?" Jessup looked at her for a long moment. Then he sighed and pulled out a sheet of paper and an envelope. "Write your letter. I'll post it in the morning." Mara sat at Jessup's desk and stared at the blank paper. "What did you say to a stranger you were asking to marry you?" In the end, she kept it simple. "Mr. Rook, I am writing in response to your notice seeking a wife. I am 26, healthy, and experienced in ranch work, bookkeeping, cooking, and general household management. I have no family I would need to bring with me and no property to complicate matters. I am willing to work hard and expect no more than you are willing to give. If these terms are acceptable, I can travel to Socorro County within 2 weeks of receiving your reply. Respectfully, Mara Vance. She folded it before she could second-guess herself, sealed it in the envelope, and addressed it in her careful script. "You're sure about this?" Jessup asked as she handed it to him. "No," Mara said honestly, "but I'm sure about leaving." She walked back to the saloon, where the party was winding down, slipped upstairs to her room without anyone noticing she'd been gone, lay in her cot, fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. 3 weeks later, the reply came. Mara was serving the lunch crowd when Jessup appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. He waited until she could break away, then pressed a letter into her hand without a word. The paper was thick, the handwriting the same careful script from the original notice. "Miss Vance, your terms are acceptable. I will send travel funds to Jessup's general store. There's a coach from Ridgeway to Socorro that runs twice monthly. I will meet you at the Territorial Land Office on the 15th. Bring practical clothing and any personal items you wish to keep. The house has basic furniture. Elias Rook." That was it. No greeting, no closing pleasantries, just facts. Mara read it 3 times, waiting for fear to hit. It didn't come. Instead, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the faint, fragile stirring of possibility. She had 2 weeks. She spent them working exactly as she always had, giving no indication that anything had changed. She listened to Caroline plan her wedding, listened to her mother discuss which china pattern to choose, listened to her father complain about costs. Nobody asked Mara what she thought. Nobody noticed when she started moving her few possessions, her extra dress, her mother's old shawl, the book of pressed flowers she'd kept since childhood, into a canvas bag hidden under her cot. The night before she was supposed to leave, Caroline finally cornered her. "James wants you to work for us," she said without preamble. She was sitting at the dressing table in her room, the room that used to be theirs, brushing her golden hair, managing the household accounts. "I know." "Will you do it?" Mara looked at her sister, really looked at her. When had Caroline become a stranger, or had she always been one? "No," Mara said. Caroline's hand stilled mid-brush. "No, I'm leaving." "Leaving? To go where? Does it matter?" "Mara." Caroline set down the brush and turned. For the first time in years, she looked uncertain. "I know Mother can be difficult. I know Father takes you for granted. But this is your home." "This was never my home. It was a place I worked for free." "That's not fair, isn't it?" Mara crossed her arms. "Tell me one thing about me, Caroline. One thing that matters. You're my sister. One thing you know about me. Not about what I do for you, not about how I'm useful. About me." Caroline opened her mouth, closed it. Her perfect face crumpled. "You're being cruel." "I'm being honest. There's a difference." Mara left before her sister could cry. Caroline's tears had always been effective weapons, and Mara couldn't afford to be swayed. Not now. Not when she was this close to finally getting out. The coach left at dawn. Mara was up before the sun, her bag packed, her travel money, $37 that had appeared at Jessup's store, far more than the coach fare, pinned inside her dress. She almost made it out clean. "Where do you think you're going?" Her father stood at the bottom of the stairs, still in his nightshirt, eyes bloodshot but focused. "Away," Mara said. "The hell you are. There's work to do. Find someone else to do it." Vernon's face went red. "You ungrateful little, I gave you a roof over your head, food in your belly. I earned both of those things 100 times over." Mara's voice was steady. "I'm leaving. You can't stop me. You've got no money, no prospects. You'll be back within a week, begging, 'I have a husband waiting for me in Socorro County.'" The silence that followed was profound. "You what?" Vernon's voice was strangled. "I answered a marriage contract. I leave this morning." "No." Vernon moved to block the door. "Absolutely not. I forbid it." "I'm 26 years old. You can't forbid me anything." "Like hell I can't. You're my daughter." "I was your servant. There's a difference." Mara pushed past him. He grabbed her arm, and for a moment she thought he might actually try to stop her by force. Then Martha appeared in her dressing gown, Caroline behind her. "Vernon, let her go," Martha said tiredly. "She can't just leave." "Yes, she can." Martha's eyes met Mara's. Something passed between them, something that might have been understanding or might have been relief. Let her go. Vernon released Mara's arm like it had burned him. Mara walked out the door, down the steps, into the street where the coach was waiting. Jessup was there, his old face sad but not surprised. He helped her climb aboard, pressed a small package into her hands. Food for the journey, he said quietly. And good luck, Mara Vance. I hope you find what you're looking for. The coach lurched forward. Mara looked back once at the saloon, the only home she'd ever known. Caroline stood in the doorway, one hand raised in a half wave. Martha was already turning away. Vernon was nowhere to be seen. Mara faced forward and didn't look back again. The journey to Socorro County took 4 days. 4 days of rough roads and rougher company, of dust and heat, and nights spent in way stations that made her father's saloon look luxurious. Mara kept to herself, spoke when spoken to, and spent the empty hours wondering what she'd done. She was traveling 200 miles to marry a stranger, a man who might be cruel, might be crazy, might be any number of terrible things. She knew nothing about him except that he owned land and didn't want romance. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm. The alternative, staying in Ridgeway, working for her sister, slowly disappearing until she was nothing but a ghost in her own life, that terrified her. At least this way, she'd chosen her own fate. Socorro County announced itself with heat, the kind of heat that made mirages shimmer on the horizon, that baked the ground until it cracked. The landscape was harsh and beautiful in its brutality. Red rock and scrub brush, mesas rising like ancient monuments, sky so blue it hurt to look at. The coach deposited her at the Territorial Land Office on the 15th, exactly as arranged. Mara climbed down, her dress stiff with dust, and stood in the shade of the building's overhang, waiting. An hour passed. Then another. The sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive. Mara drank the last of her water and wondered if she'd been stood up. Then she saw him. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, with broad shoulders and a horseman's easy posture. But it was the scars that caught her attention. They covered the left side of his face and neck, disappearing beneath his collar, the kind of scars that came from fire. His hair was dark and overlong, as if he'd stopped caring about such things. He was probably handsome under the damage, but it was hard to tell. He stopped 10 feet away, studying her with eyes the color of winter sky. "Miss Vance," his voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "Mr. Rook." They stared at each other. Mara waited for him to say something about her appearance, to show disappointment or relief or anything. His face remained impassive. "You're taller than I expected," he said finally. "Is that a problem?" "No." Another silence. "Do you have any questions before we proceed?" he asked. "Will you hurt me?" The bluntness of it seemed to surprise him. Something flickered in his eyes, not anger, but something else. "No." "Then I have no questions." The magistrate is waiting inside. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took less than 10 minutes. They stood before a board official who read through the legal requirements in a monotone, asked if they consented, and had them sign their names in a ledger. Elias produced a plain gold band that was slightly too large for Mara's finger, and just like that, she was married. They walked out into the brutal sunshine as husband and wife, two strangers bound by law and desperation. "The ranch is 3 hours north," Elias said, untying a horse from the hitching post. "Can you ride?" "Yes." He helped her mount. His hands were careful, impersonal, then swung onto his own horse. They rode out of town without another word. The land they traveled through was unforgiving. Mara had thought Ridgeway was harsh, but this was different. This was a landscape that didn't just test you, it tried to kill you. The sun was relentless, the wind carried grit that stung exposed skin, and the few plants that managed to survive were armed with thorns and spines. But there was a brutal beauty to it, too. The way the light turned the rock formations gold and crimson, the vast emptiness of the sky, the sense that out here, stripped of everything soft and comfortable, you either became harder or broke. Mara had been breaking for years. Maybe it was time to become hard instead. They rode in silence until Mara couldn't stand it anymore. "How did you get the scars?" Elias's shoulders tensed. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Fire," he said finally. "I gathered that." "How?" "Why do you need to know?" "Because I'm going to be living with you. Because I'd rather know now than wonder. He was quiet for so long she thought the conversation was over. Then, house fire 5 years ago. I got out. My wife didn't. The words were flat, emotionless, but Mara heard what he wasn't saying. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be. It's done. They rode on. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, Elias pointed to a dark shape on the horizon. There. The ranch, when they reached it, was not what Mara had expected. The house was larger than she'd thought. 2 stories, built of adobe and wood, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. But it was clearly neglected. Shutters hung crooked, the porch sagged, and one of the second-floor windows was broken. The barn and outbuildings were in better shape, which told Mara where Elias's priorities lay. He helped her dismount, took both horses to the barn. Mara stood in the yard, looking at what was now, legally, her home. It looked like a place where hope had died. Elias emerged from the barn and walked past her to the house without a word. Mara followed. Inside was dark and sparse, furniture arranged for function, not comfort. A layer of dust covered everything. No curtains, no rugs, no softness anywhere. Your room is upstairs, first door on the right, Elias said. I'm across the hall, kitchen's through there. Help yourself to whatever you need. What are the expectations? He turned to look at her, his scarred face half in shadow. Expectations? You said this was a legal partnership. What are my duties? Keep the house, manage supplies. I'll teach you the ranch work if you want to learn. Beyond that, he shrugged. Do what you want. And the marriage itself? What about it? Are you expecting conjugal relations? His expression didn't change. No. The relief must have shown on her face because something that might have been humor crossed his features. I told you in the letter, no romantic expectations. I needed a legal wife to secure land rights. You needed a way out. That's the arrangement. What if that changes? It won't. He said it with such finality that Mara believed him. This was a man who had loved once and lost everything. He wasn't looking to try again. Neither was she. All right, Mara said. Then we understand each other. We do. Elias moved toward the stairs, then paused. There's one thing you should know. What's that? People will come around sometimes. Neighbors, if you can call them that. They'll ask questions. Be curious. His jaw tightened. Don't tell them more than they need to know. I wasn't planning to. He nodded and climbed the stairs, his boots heavy on the old wood. Mara stood alone in the empty house and thought, I've made a terrible mistake. Then she thought, or maybe I've finally made the right choice. Only time would tell which. Mara woke to silence so complete it felt like drowning. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was wrong, rough-hewn beams instead of cracked plaster. The air smelled different, dry and dusty, with undertones of something she couldn't identify. Then memory crashed back. The journey, the hasty wedding, the empty house. The stranger downstairs who was now her husband. She sat up slowly, taking stock of her surroundings in the thin dawn light. The room was bare except for a narrow bed, a washstand, and a trunk that looked older than she was. The window, mercifully intact, unlike the one she'd seen broken from outside, faced east, and through it she could see the landscape that would be her new reality. Red earth stretching to the horizon. Scrub brush and rock formations that looked like sleeping giants. Sky so vast it made her feel small and exposed and strangely free all at once. She'd chosen this. For better or worse, she'd chosen it. Mara dressed quickly in her work dress, braided her hair, and made her way downstairs. The house was still dark, still silent. She half expected to find Elias already gone, but he was in the kitchen, standing over a cast-iron stove that looked like it had survived a war. "Coffee's ready," he said without turning around. "Cups are in the cabinet." She found a chipped mug and poured herself coffee so strong it could strip paint, took a sip, and managed not to grimace. "I make it strong," Elias said, still not looking at her. "If that's a problem, it's fine." He finally turned, his scarred face unreadable in the dim light. He was already dressed for work, rough canvas pants, a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, boots that had seen better days. Without the coat he'd worn yesterday, she could see that the scars didn't stop at his neck. They ran down his left arm, disappearing under the fabric. "I need to check the cattle," he said. "There's food in the pantry if you're hungry. I'll be back around noon." "What do you want me to do?" "Whatever you want." That's not an answer. Something that might have been irritation crossed his face. "I'm not your father or your employer. You don't need my permission to exist." The words hit harder than he probably intended. Mara set down her coffee cup carefully. "I'm aware of that. But this is your house, your ranch. I'd like to know what needs doing." Elias was quiet for a moment, studying her with those winter sky eyes. "House needs cleaning, badly. Pantry needs inventory. I lose track of what I have. There's a vegetable garden out back that's more weeds than vegetables at this point." He paused. "But those are suggestions, not orders. Do what you want." He left before she could respond, the back door closing with a soft thud that somehow felt final. Mara stood alone in the kitchen of a stranger's house. Her house now, legally, and made a decision. She hadn't traveled 200 miles to sit around being useless. She started with the kitchen because it was the most manageable. The pantry revealed supplies that had been purchased with no plan or organization. Flour next to lamp oil, coffee mixed in with nails, dried beans scattered loose across shelves. It took her 2 hours to sort through everything, throw out what was spoiled, and create some semblance of order. The kitchen itself was functional but filthy. Mara scrubbed the stove, the counters, the floor, washed dishes that looked like they hadn't been properly cleaned in months, found mouse droppings in the corners, and made a mental note to set traps. By the time Elias returned at noon, she'd transformed the space from barely functional to actually usable. He stopped in the doorway, looking around with an expression she couldn't read. "You didn't have to do all this," he said finally. "I know. I mean it. This wasn't part of the arrangement." The arrangement was a legal partnership. Partners contribute. Mara wiped her hands on her apron. "Besides, I needed something to do. Sitting around makes me nervous." Elias nodded slowly. "There's bread and cheese in the pantry. Help yourself." They ate in silence, standing at opposite ends of the kitchen. It should have been awkward, but somehow it wasn't. There was something almost comfortable about the lack of expectation, the absence of forced conversation. "I need to ride out to the north pasture this afternoon," Elias said when he'd finished. "Check the fence line. You can come if you want. See the property." "I'd like that." The ranch, Mara discovered, was both larger and more precarious than she'd realized. 640 acres of land that would have been worthless anywhere else but here, where water was scarce and good grazing even scarcer, was a substantial holding. But substantial didn't mean profitable. They rode for an hour before reaching the north fence, and what Mara saw along the way worried her. Cattle that were too thin, water sources that were little more than mud, vegetation that looked barely adequate to sustain the herd. "How many head do you run?" she asked. 150. Should be 200, but I lost 50 last year to drought." "What happens if we lose more?" "We don't." His tone didn't invite further questions. The fence line, when they reached it, was in poor repair, posts leaning at dangerous angles, wire sagging or missing entirely. Elias dismounted and began working without a word, and Mara climbed down to help. "You know how to string wire?" he asked, clearly surprised. "I've mended fence before. My father's saloon backed up to a cattle pen. The drunk cowboys would ride through the fence at least once a month." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Elias's face. "All right then." They worked through the afternoon heat, replacing posts and restringing wire. It was hard, dirty work, and Mara's hands were raw by the time they finished. But there was something satisfying about it. Something real. "You're stronger than you look," Elias observed as they prepared to head back. "I'm stronger than most people assume." "I'm starting to see that." They rode back as the sun began its descent, painting the brutal landscape in shades of gold and amber. Mara found herself studying the land with new eyes, trying to see past the harshness to the potential underneath. "Why here?" she asked suddenly. "Of all the places you could have settled, why this territory?" Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Because nobody else wanted it. Because the land was cheap and I needed distance. Because—" He stopped. "Because some places match what you feel inside. This land is hard and damaged and trying to survive despite everything working against it." He glanced at her. his scarred face half in shadow. I understood that. Mara nodded slowly. She understood it too. The days that followed developed a rhythm. Elias would rise before dawn, make coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and head out to work the ranch. Mara would clean, organize, cook, and gradually begin learning the property. They'd cross paths at meals, sparse affairs where conversation was minimal but not uncomfortable, and sometimes in the evenings, when Elias would do bookwork by lamplight, and Mara would mend clothes or read from the single book she'd brought with her. It wasn't companionship exactly, but it wasn't loneliness either. On the fourth day, their first visitor arrived. Mara was in the vegetable garden, if the patch of struggling plants could be called that, when she heard the wagon. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a woman driving a buckboard with 2 children in the back. The woman was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and capable hands. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with the ease of someone who'd been doing it her whole life. "You must be the new wife," she said without preamble. "I'm Helen Garrett. My husband runs the ranch east of here. These are my boys, Samuel and Thomas." The boys, maybe 8 and 10, stared at Mara with open curiosity. "Mara Rook," she said, the name still feeling foreign on her tongue. "Rook, is it? So you actually went through with the wedding. Some of us thought maybe Elias had scared you off." Helen smiled, but there was assessment in her eyes. "How are you settling in?" "Well enough." "That's a polite way of saying this place is a disaster. I saw the house when Martha was still alive. She kept it nice." Helen glanced at the sagging porch, the broken window. "Elias let it all go after she died." Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Martha was his first wife? You didn't know?" Helen's eyebrows rose. "What did he tell you?" "That there was a fire. That his wife died." "Well, that's true enough. Though there's more to it than that." Helen seemed to realize she'd said too much. "But I suppose that's his story to tell." She reached into the wagon and pulled out a cloth-covered basket. "Brought you some bread and preserves. Welcome to the territory, such as it is." "Thank you. That's kind." "Kind nothing. Out here we help each other because if we don't, we all die." Helen's voice was matter-of-fact. "Speaking of which, there's a territorial meeting in 2 weeks. All the ranchers get together to discuss water rights, grazing issues, that sort of thing. You and Elias should come. I'll mention it to him. You do that. And Mara?" Helen's expression softened slightly. "I know this land seems harsh, and Elias seems difficult, but there are good people here. Don't isolate yourself." She climbed back into the wagon, called to her boys, and drove off, leaving Mara standing in the yard with a basket of bread and more questions than she'd had before. That evening, she brought up the meeting while they ate. Helen Garrett stopped by today. Elias's fork paused halfway to his mouth. What did she want? "To meet me, and to tell us about a territorial meeting in 2 weeks. We're not going." "Why not?" "Because I don't go to those things." Helen said it's about water rights and grazing. "I know what it's about." Elias set down his fork. "And I'm not going. That seems short-sighted. If decisions are being made that affect the ranch, they make their decisions regardless of whether I'm there." Mara studied him across the table. "Helen also mentioned your first wife, Martha." Everything about Elias went still. "What about her?" "She said Martha kept the house nice, that you let it go after she died." "Helen talks too much." "She was trying to be helpful." "She was gossiping." Elias stood abruptly. "My first marriage is none of your concern." "It is if it affects this one." "It doesn't." "Then why won't you talk about it?" "Because there's nothing to say." His voice rose, and Mara saw something flash in his eyes. Not anger, but pain. Raw and barely contained. "She's dead. The house burned. I got out with my life, and these," he gestured at his scars. "That's all there is." "I don't believe you." The words hung in the air between them. Elias stared at her, his jaw working. Then he turned and walked out, letting the screen door slam behind him. Mara sat alone at the table, listening to his footsteps cross the porch, fade into the distance. She'd pushed too hard, she knew that. But she also knew that whatever had happened with Martha was still eating at Elias, still shaping everything he did. And if they were going to make this arrangement work, if they were going to survive out here, they couldn't keep dancing around the truth. She found him an hour later in the barn, working on a piece of tack by lamplight. He didn't look up when she entered. "I'm sorry," Mara said. "I shouldn't have pushed." "No, you shouldn't have. But I need to understand, not because I'm curious, but because we're partners. And partners need to trust each other." Elias's hand stilled. He was quiet for a long time, and Mara thought maybe she'd ruined whatever fragile accord they'd built. Then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Martha and I were married 6 years. We met in Santa Fe. She was a teacher. I was working as a ranch hand. She was beautiful and kind, and she saw something in me worth saving." He paused. "I built this place for her. Every board, every nail. It was supposed to be our future. What happened? I came home from a cattle drive, and the house was on fire. She was inside, and the front door was barred from the outside. I broke through, tried to get to her, but the fire—" He touched his scarred face. "This is what I got for trying. She was already gone." Mara's breath caught. Barred from the outside? Someone locked her in? That's what it looked like. But there was no proof, no way to know for sure. Could have been an accident. Maybe she barred it herself for safety and couldn't get it open when the fire started. That's what the marshal said. But you don't believe that. I don't know what I believe. All I know is my wife died screaming and I couldn't save her. His voice cracked. So yeah, I let the house go to hell. Hard to care about curtains and gardens when the whole place is a tomb. Mara moved closer, careful not to spook him. I'm sorry. That's a weight no one should have to carry. It's my weight to carry, not yours. Maybe, but we're carrying it together now, whether you like it or not. That's what partnership means. Elias finally looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not softening, exactly, but opening, just a crack. Why did you really answer my notice? He asked. The truth this time. I told you. You told me you needed a way out. But there are other ways out. You could have found work somewhere, started over. Why marry a stranger? Mara sat down on a barrel, suddenly tired. Because I was tired of being invisible. Tired of working for people who didn't see me as human. At least with you, the transaction was honest. You needed a legal wife, I needed an escape. No pretense, no promises about love or happiness or any of those lies people tell themselves. That's pretty cynical for 26. I earned it. Yeah, Elias said quietly. I suppose you did. They sat in the barn's dusty lamplight, two damaged people who'd found each other through desperation and paperwork. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly hopeful. But it was honest, and maybe that was enough. The next morning, Mara woke to find a hammer and nails on her dresser, along with a note in Elias's precise handwriting, for the broken window. She smiled despite herself and got to work. Over the following days, something shifted between them. Not intimacy, they were still strangers in most ways, but a kind of working trust. Elias started explaining ranch operations to her, teaching her to read the signs of the land. Mara began asking questions about the business side, and discovered that Elias was barely keeping the operation solvent. You're paying too much for feed, she said one evening, looking over his ledgers. And this cattle buyer is taking advantage of you. I know. Then why? Because I don't have options. The feed supplier is the only one within 50 miles. The buyer knows it. What about the territorial meeting? If the ranchers work together, I told you I'm not going. Then let me go. Elias looked up sharply. What? You won't go, fine. But someone should represent this ranch. Might as well be me. They won't take you seriously. You're a woman, and you're new. I've been running a business since I was 12 years old. I can handle a room full of ranchers. Mara said. What's the worst that can happen? They ignore me? I'm used to that. She met his eyes. Let me try. He stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You're stubborn. Yes. All right, but don't say I didn't warn you. The territorial meeting was held in what passed for a town hall, really just a large barn 20 miles south. Mara rode in with Helen Garrett, who'd offered transportation and moral support. Most of these men have been running cattle since before you were born, Helen warned as they approached. They're not going to like taking direction from a woman half their age. I'm not trying to give direction. I'm trying to learn. That's smart. Listen first, talk later. The barn was crowded with ranchers and their families, maybe 40 people total. Mara recognized some faces from her brief time in the territory, but most were strangers. Hard men with weathered faces and calculating eyes. Women who looked like they'd survived things that would have broken softer people. The meeting was called to order by a man Helen identified as Thomas Warren, who owned the largest spread in the county. First order of business, Warren said, his voice carrying across the barn. Water rights. The creek that feeds the eastern properties is running at 50% capacity. We need to establish rationing before someone gets greedy. The discussion that followed was heated, with multiple ranchers claiming historical precedent and others arguing for equal distribution. Mara listened carefully, noting who allied with whom, who held grudges, who could be reasoned with. The Rook place has creek access, someone called out. But Elias isn't here to speak for it. His wife is, Helen said firmly, gesturing to Mara. Every eye in the barn turned toward her. Mara stood slowly, feeling the weight of their scrutiny. My husband asked me to represent our interests, she said, keeping her voice level. We're willing to work within whatever framework the group decides, provided it's fair to all parties. Fair? Warren snorted. Your husband hasn't attended a meeting in 5 years. Now he sends his mail-order bride to speak for him? Mara felt her face heat, but kept her expression neutral. I'm his legal wife and partner. That gives me the right to speak. Rights don't mean much out here, girl. What matters is whether you can back them up. Then let's talk about backing things up. Mara pulled out the ranch ledgers she'd brought. Our property uses less water than most of yours because we run a smaller herd. We're not the problem here. The problem is that 3 ranches, she named them, are drawing more than their fair share and have been for years. The silence that followed was profound. That's a serious accusation, Warren said slowly. It's a fact. I've seen the creek flow patterns. I've talked to the other small operators. The big ranches are taking more than their allocated share, and the rest of us are paying for it. You've been here 2 weeks, and you think you understand our water systems? I understand numbers. And I understand when people are being cheated. A man Mara didn't know stood up. She's right. I've been saying the same thing for 2 years, but nobody listened. Because you run 20 head, Charlie. You don't matter. Maybe he should, Mara said. Maybe we all should, because if this drought continues and we keep fighting each other instead of working together, none of us will survive. Warren studied her with new interest. You got a proposal? Equal rationing based on herd size and historical water usage, with penalties for anyone who exceeds their allocation, monitored by a neutral party, rotated monthly. That's complicated. It's fair, and fair is what keeps people from killing each other over water. Someone laughed, but it wasn't entirely unkind. Warren nodded slowly. We'll put it to a vote. All in favor? The vote was closer than it should have been, but it passed. Mara sat down, her heart hammering, and felt Helen pat her shoulder. Not bad, Helen whispered. You just made some enemies, but you also made some allies. The meeting continued for another hour, covering grazing rotation and the threat of the mining company that was buying up land to the south. That part caught Mara's attention. Cordova Mining, Warren explained. They've been acquiring properties for 6 months now, offering top dollar, which makes it hard for folks to say no. What do they want the land for? Mara asked. Copper, supposedly, but they're being secretive about it, and they don't care much about the people already living here. Have they approached the Rook place? Not yet, but they will. They want everything between the creek and the mesa. Mara filed that information away. After the meeting, several ranchers approached her, some to complain, others to express grudging respect. One elderly man with a kind face introduced himself as William Hayes. Your husband, he said quietly. How is he? He's well enough. I knew Martha. She was a lovely woman. What happened to her? He shook his head. Tell Elias I asked after him, will you? I will. On the ride back, Helen was uncharacteristically quiet. What? Mara asked finally. You handled yourself well in there. Better than I expected. But you should know, Thomas Warren doesn't forget when someone makes him look foolish. And you did that today. I stated facts. Facts that exposed his allies as cheaters, same thing. Helen glanced at her. Just be careful. This territory is hard enough without making powerful enemies. I'll keep that in mind. When Mara got home, she found Elias working on the porch railing he'd been meaning to fix for weeks. He looked up as she dismounted. How was it? Interesting. We got water rationing passed based on herd size. His eyebrows rose. We? You mean they actually listened to you? Some did, some didn't. I made a few enemies, apparently. Warren? How did you know? Because Warren makes enemies out of anyone who challenges him, which is why I stopped going to those meetings. Elias set down his hammer. What did you say to him? Mara recounted the meeting, watching his expression shift from surprise to something that might have been pride. You called out the big ranches for water theft? Someone needed to. Mara, those are powerful men. I'm aware. Helen already warned me. She climbed the porch steps. Also, there's a mining company buying up land, Cordova Mining. They want everything between the creek and the mesa, which includes our property. Elias went still. They haven't approached me. Hayes said they will, soon. Let them. I'm not selling. Even if they offer a lot of money? This land is all I have left of... He stopped. I'm not selling. Mara nodded. Then we'll need to be ready when they come. That night, Mara lay in bed listening to the wind rattle the shutters and thought about everything she'd learned. About the precarious state of the ranch, the powerful enemies they'd apparently made, the mysterious mining companies circling like vultures. She'd come here looking for escape, for a chance to exist on her own terms. Instead, she'd found herself in the middle of territory politics and old wounds and conflicts she didn't fully understand. But for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt necessary, and maybe, just maybe, that was worth the risk. The men from Cordova Mining arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the territorial meeting. Mara was in the garden, trying to coax life from soil that seemed determined to remain barren, when she heard the wagon. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and watched 2 men in city suits climb down like they were stepping into something distasteful. The first man was tall and lean, with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The second was younger, broader, carrying a leather satchel that probably cost more than Elias made in a year. Mrs. Rook? The older man called out. I'm Richard Sutton, representing Cordova Mining. This is my associate, Mr. Pierce. We're hoping to speak with your husband. He's working the north pasture. Perhaps you could fetch him. This is a matter of some importance. Mara set down her garden spade and walked toward them, noting how both men's gazes swept over her dismissively before returning to scan the property. Looking for Elias. Looking past her like she was furniture. Perhaps you could tell me what this is about, she said evenly. I'm his partner. Anything you need to discuss with him, you can discuss with me. Sutton's smile tightened. This is a business matter, Mrs. Rook. A substantial business matter. I really think... Then you really should start talking. I handle the business affairs. That was a stretch. Mara had been managing the books for less than a month, but something in Sutton's condescending tone made her spine stiffen. Very well. Sutton gestured to Pierce, who opened the satchel and pulled out a document. Cordova Mining is acquiring land in this territory for development purposes. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for your property. We're not selling. You haven't heard the offer yet. Don't need to. The answer is no. Sutton's smile never wavered. Mrs. Rook, I don't think you understand the opportunity here. We're offering 3 times the market value. That's enough money to buy property somewhere more hospitable. Somewhere with actual water, decent grazing, a future. This place has a future. Does it? Sutton looked around pointedly, at the sagging porch, the struggling garden, the dust devils spinning across the empty pasture. From where I'm standing, it looks like you're 1 bad season away from losing everything. From where I'm standing, you're trespassing, so unless you have something new to say, 5 times market value. The number hung in the air. Mara felt her breath catch. 5 times market value would be enough to start over anywhere, buy land that wasn't trying to kill you, build something that didn't require bleeding for every inch of progress. No, she said. That's a foolish decision. It's our decision to make. Is it? Sutton's tone shifted, the false friendliness evaporating. Because from what I understand, this ranch is barely solvent. You're behind on your land taxes. Your cattle are starving. Your husband is, he paused delicately, damaged. How long do you really think you can hold out? As long as it takes. Mrs. Rook, the answer is no. Now get off our property. Sutton studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded to Pierce, who tucked the document away. We'll be back, Sutton said pleasantly. And next time, we'll speak with your husband. Perhaps he'll be more reasonable. They climbed into their wagon and drove off, leaving Mara standing in the yard with her heart hammering and her hands shaking. She was still standing there when Elias rode in 20 minutes later. He took one look at her face and dismounted quickly. What happened? Cordova Mining. They made an offer, 5 times market value. Elias went very still. What did you tell them? No. Just like that? You didn't even... I told them we're not selling. Was I wrong? He stared at her, something complicated working across his scarred face. No, you weren't wrong, but 5 times market value. He ran a hand through his hair. That's more money than I've seen in my life. Do you want to sell? No, but I want you to understand what you're turning down. That money could buy you a life that doesn't involve fighting this land every single day. I didn't come here for an easy life. What did you come here for? Mara opened her mouth, then closed it. What had she come here for? Escape? Purpose? The chance to build something that was hers? I came here to stop being invisible, she said finally. Selling to Cordova would just be another way of disappearing. Elias nodded slowly. All right then. We're not selling. Sutton said they'd be back. Said they'd talk to you directly next time. Let them come. The answer will be the same. But there was something in his voice that made Mara uneasy. A flatness that suggested he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear, not what he actually felt. That night, she found him on the porch, staring out at the dark landscape. You're angry, she said. I'm not. You've barely said 10 words since dinner. Elias was quiet for a long time. I'm trying to figure out if I'm being stubborn or stupid. There's a difference. What do you mean? I mean, maybe holding on to this place is just pride. Maybe the smart thing would be to take the money and start over somewhere that isn't actively trying to kill us. Mara sat down beside him, the porch boards creaking under her weight. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want anymore. His voice was raw. I built this place for Martha. Everything here is connected to her. The house we designed together, the land we planned to fill with cattle and children and a life that mattered. After she died, I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning her all over again. But now I don't know if I'm honoring her memory or just punishing myself. Mara understood that kind of pain. The weight of staying in places that hurt you because leaving felt like betrayal. What would Martha want? She asked quietly. Martha would want me to be practical. She was always the practical one. Elias looked at her. What do you want? I want to fight for something that's mine, even if it's hard, especially if it's hard. Why? Because I spent my whole life making other people's lives easier while mine got smaller and smaller. I'm tired of small. I'm tired of easy. I want something that requires everything I have. Elias studied her in the dim light from the window. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Something that might have been a smile touched his lips. All right, we fight. But we do it smart. Cordova didn't offer that kind of money out of kindness. They want this land for a reason, which means there's something here worth having. Copper, according to Warren. Maybe. Or maybe something else. Elias stood. Tomorrow I'm writing to the territorial office. There are mining surveys on file. I want to see what they know about this land that I don't. I'm coming with you. Mara, we're partners. That means we figure this out together. He nodded. Partners. The territorial office was a 3-hour ride through landscape that grew increasingly desolate. By the time they arrived, Mara's back ached and her skin felt scoured by wind and dust. The office itself was a squat adobe building that looked like it had been there since the territory was settled. The clerk was a dried-up man named Morrison, who looked annoyed at the interruption. Mining surveys, he said, shuffling through papers. What property? Section 18, range 23. Elias gave the legal description of their land. Morrison disappeared into the back room and returned 15 minutes later with a folder so dust-covered it left prints on his desk. "This what you're looking for?" The survey was dated 8 years earlier, commissioned by a company that had gone bankrupt before completing their exploration. But the preliminary findings were there, sketched out in technical language Mara barely understood. Elias read it slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. "What is it?" Mara asked. "Copper deposits, substantial ones according to this, running right through the center of our property." He looked up. "That's why Cordova wants the land. They're not offering 5 times market value out of generosity. They're offering it because the land is worth 10 times that much. So we were right not to sell. We were right, but we're also in trouble. If Cordova knows about these deposits, they're not going to give up just because we said no." Morrison cleared his throat. "If you're concerned about legal protection, you might want to file a mineral rights claim. Establishes your ownership of subsurface resources." "How long does that take?" "Couple weeks, usually, assuming nobody contests it." "And if they do?" Morrison shrugged. "Then it goes to the territorial court. Could take months." Elias and Mara exchanged a look. Months they might not have. "File it," Elias said. "Today." They spent the next hour completing paperwork, with Morrison explaining the process in a monotone that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times. When they finally emerged into the afternoon sun, Mara felt exhausted. "Now what?" she asked. "Now we wait, and hope Cordova doesn't have better lawyers than we do." The ride back was quiet, both of them lost in thought. They were halfway home when Elias suddenly pulled up his horse. "What?" Mara stopped beside him. "Look." He pointed to the horizon, where a dark smudge was spreading across the sky. "Is that smoke?" "Yeah, coming from the direction of our ranch." They rode hard, pushing the horses faster than was safe across the rough terrain. The smoke grew thicker as they approached, and Mara's stomach twisted with dread. But when they crested the final rise, it wasn't the house burning. It was the barn. Flames were already consuming the structure, fed by the dry wood and old hay stored inside. Elias didn't even dismount properly. He was off his horse and running before it had fully stopped. "The horses!" he shouted. Mara could see them through the open barn doors. 3 of their 5 horses still inside, screaming in terror. Elias ran straight into the smoke, and Mara's heart stopped. She dismounted and ran after him, pulling her bandana up over her mouth and nose. The heat hit her like a physical force, and the smoke made her eyes stream. She could barely see Elias ahead of her, could hear him coughing as he struggled with the terrified horses. He got the first one out, then the second. Mara grabbed the lead rope of the 3rd horse, a young mare that was wild with panic, and pulled with everything she had. The mare reared, nearly crushing her, but Mara held on and dragged the animal toward the door. They burst out into the open air just as part of the barn roof collapsed behind them. The mare bolted the moment Mara released her, but she was alive. They were all alive. Elias was on his knees in the dirt, coughing so hard Mara thought he might vomit. She knelt beside him, one hand on his back. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, unable to speak. His shirt was singed in places, and his face was black with soot. The scars on his neck stood out livid against the darkness. They watched the barn burn. There was nothing they could do, no water source close enough, no way to fight a fire that size. Everything they'd stored inside, tools, tack, feed for the winter, was gone. When Elias could finally speak, his voice was hoarse. "This wasn't an accident." "How do you know?" "The doors were all open. Someone wanted the horses to panic, wanted us to run in there." He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and furious. "This was a message." "From Cordova?" "Who else?" Mara felt cold despite the heat still radiating from the burning barn. "They tried to kill you." "They tried to scare us. There's a difference." "Is there? You ran into a burning barn, Elias. You could have died." "The horses are just horses. You're—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "I'm what?" Mara stood abruptly and walked away before she could say something she wasn't ready to say. Before she could admit that in the weeks since she'd arrived, Elias had become more than just a legal arrangement. He'd become someone she cared about keeping alive. That night, they slept in shifts, watching the smoldering remains of the barn and listening for any sign of further trouble. None came, But in the morning, they found something worse. Cattle. 20 head, dead in the north pasture, poisoned from the looks of it, though Elias said he'd need to check with someone who knew more about such things. They're escalating, Mara said, looking at the carcasses scattered across the ground like broken toys. Yeah. What do we do? What can we do? We can't prove Cordova did this. And even if we could, the nearest lawman is 3 days away and probably in Sutton's pocket anyway. So we just let them destroy everything we have? No. Elias's jaw tightened. We fight back, but smart. Not with fire and violence. That's what they want. They want us angry enough to make mistakes. Then how? I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Helen Garrett arrived that afternoon with her husband John, a quiet man who spoke rarely but saw everything. They'd seen the smoke from their property and come to help. 20 head, John said, surveying the dead cattle. That's a hard loss. It's more than hard. It might finish us. Elias's voice was flat. We were already running thin. This puts us under. Unless you sell to Cordova, Helen said quietly. Which I'm guessing is the point. We're not selling. Even if it means losing everything? Especially then. John was quiet for a moment, studying the dead cattle with the careful attention of a man who'd spent his life reading the land. Then he crouched down and examined one of the carcasses more closely. This isn't poison, he said. What? Elias moved to join him. Look at the mouths. No foam, no discoloration, and they're all lying in a line like they dropped while walking. John stood. This is tainted water. Somebody dumped something in your creek upstream. That's worse than poison, Mara said. If the water's contaminated, everything downstream is at risk, not just our cattle, everyone who draws from that creek. Elias was already moving toward his horse. We need to find the source, now. They rode upstream, following the creek as it wound through increasingly rough terrain. It took 2 hours to find it, a torn sack of what looked like mining chemicals, deliberately dumped where the water pooled before flowing onto their property. Arsenic compound, John said, reading the remnants of the label. Used in ore processing, deadly to livestock, makes humans sick. But doesn't last long in running water, Helen added, which means they timed this deliberately. Waited until your cattle would be watering, dumped it, and let nature do the work. Elias stared at the sack with an expression Mara had never seen before. Not anger, something colder, more focused. Take it, he said to John. Keep it safe. We're going to need evidence. Evidence for what? You planning to report this? I'm planning to bury Cordova mining so deep they'll never see daylight again, but I need time, and I need proof. He turned to Helen. What do you know about the territorial marshal? Clayton. He's honest enough, but he's one man covering a territory the size of some eastern states. By the time he could investigate this, Cordova will have covered their tracks. What about the Federal Land Office? Federal? Helen's eyebrows rose. You think this is big enough to get federal attention? If it involves water contamination that affects multiple properties, environmental damage, possible fraud in land acquisition. Elias was thinking out loud now, the pieces clicking together. Yeah, I think it might be. That's a long shot, Elias. It's the only shot we have. They rode back to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the brutal landscape in shades of blood and gold. Mara watched Elias's profile against the dying light and saw something she'd missed before. Not just grief and damage, but a core of steel that no fire had been able to melt. You have a plan, she said, the start of one. Tell me. Cordova Mining is operating on the assumption that we're just ignorant ranchers who'll roll over when pressured. They think we're isolated, powerless, and desperate enough to take whatever they offer. Aren't we? We were. But they made a mistake today. They didn't just attack us. They contaminated water that flows through 6 other properties. They made this everybody's problem. Understanding dawned. The territorial meeting, you want to bring this to the other ranchers. Not just want, need. If we can prove Cordova is willing to poison water sources to get what they want, every rancher in this territory becomes our ally. Because if they'll do it to us, they'll do it to anyone. Will they believe us? You haven't exactly been popular with that group. They'll believe you. Mara felt her stomach drop. Me? You're the one who stood up to Warren, The one who called out the water theft. They might not like you, but they respect you. Elias looked at her directly. I need you to do it again, but this time the stakes are higher. What are you asking? I'm asking you to organize the ranchers, get them to stand together against Cordova, and buy me time to get to the federal office in Santa Fe and file a formal complaint. Santa Fe is a week's ride. I know. You're leaving me here alone? You won't be alone. You'll have the Garretts, the other ranchers who are willing to help, and you're stronger than you think, Mara, strong enough to hold things together while I'm gone. She wanted to argue, wanted to say this was too much, too fast, that she'd only been here a few weeks and didn't know what she was doing. But she'd said she wanted something that required everything she had. This was that thing. All right, she said, I'll do it. Elias's expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I might fail. You won't. How do you know? Because you're the woman who turned down 5 times market value without blinking. You're the woman who ran into a burning barn to save a horse. You're the woman who made a room full of hardened ranchers vote for water rationing. He paused. You're not the invisible girl anymore, Mara, and I don't think you ever were. You just needed someone to see you. The words hit her like a physical blow. She turned away before he could see her face, before he could see how much those words meant to someone who'd spent her entire life being overlooked. When do you leave? She managed. Dawn, which gives us tonight to plan. They spent the hours until midnight mapping out strategy. Elias would ride hard for Santa Fe, carrying the contaminated sack and every piece of documentation they had about Cordova's activities. Mara would call an emergency territorial meeting, present the evidence of water contamination, and try to organize a united front against further intimidation. If Cordova comes back while I'm gone, Elias said, don't engage with them. Don't negotiate, don't threaten, don't do anything that gives them legal ammunition. Just hold the line. What if they try something else? Another fire, more dead cattle. Then you document everything. Photos if you can, written testimony if you can't. We need a record that will hold up in federal court. You're assuming the federal office will care. They'll care if we give them no choice. Elias looked grim. Environmental contamination on federal land, fraud in mineral rights acquisition, intimidation and possible assault. That's enough to at least trigger an investigation. And an investigation is all we need to buy time. Time for what? Time to make Cordova realize that crushing us is more expensive than leaving us alone. It was a plan built on hope and desperation in equal measure. But it was all they had. Elias left before sunrise, riding out with saddlebags packed with evidence and provisions for the long journey. Mara stood in the yard and watched him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. She had work to do. The first thing she did was ride to the Garrett property and ask John to help her photograph the dead cattle and the contamination site. He had an old camera he used for livestock records, and together they documented everything: the position of the carcasses, the torn chemical sack, the water pooling downstream. This'll hold up in court, John said, carefully packing the photographic plates, assuming you can get it to someone who cares. We'll make them care. Next, Mara drafted a letter explaining the situation and hand-delivered copies to every ranch within riding distance. Some people welcomed her warmly. Others were suspicious. A few were outright hostile. Thomas Warren was the worst. You're asking us to go to war with a mining company based on what? Dead cattle and your word? Warren's face was red. For all we know, you poisoned your own water to create drama. Why would I do that? To avoid selling, to get sympathy. Hell, maybe just because you're a woman and women are irrational. He leaned forward. Your husband left you here alone, which tells me he doesn't think much of your judgment either. Mara felt anger burn through her, hot and clarifying. My husband is riding to Santa Fe to file federal charges. He trusts me to hold things together while he's gone, which is more than most men would do. And if you think I'd kill my own cattle for sympathy, you're not just wrong, you're stupid. Warren's face went from red to purple. Get off my property. Gladly. But when Cordova comes for your land, and they will, don't expect help from people you turned away. She rode off before he could respond, her hands shaking on the reins. The emergency meeting was held 4 days after Elias left. Mara had managed to secure the barn again, and this time more than half the territory's ranchers showed up. Some came out of curiosity, some out of genuine concern, and a few, like Warren, came to cause trouble. Mara stood before them and told the truth about Cordova's offer, about the fire, about the poisoned water and dead cattle. She showed John's photographs and passed around a sample of the arsenic compound in a sealed jar. "This isn't just about my ranch," she said. "This is about what happens when we let someone with money and power push us around. Today, it's my water. Tomorrow, it's yours. Next week, they'll be buying off the marshal and the land office and anyone else who might protect us." "Or," Warren called out, "this is about one woman trying to drum up support because her husband made a bad business decision. My husband made the decision not to sell. I supported it. We both stand by it. Even if it ruins you?" Even then, a rancher named Patterson stood up. "I don't know the Rooks well, but I know Cordova Mining. They approached me last month, offered me triple market value for my land. When I said no, 2 of my wells mysteriously dried up." He looked around the barn. "I thought it was bad luck at the time. Now I'm not so sure." Others began speaking up. Strange accidents, pressure from buyers, instances of intimidation that they'd written off as coincidence. The pattern was undeniable. "What are you proposing?" someone asked. "A collective agreement. We all refuse to sell to Cordova. We document any further intimidation. We support each other if they escalate." Mara took a breath. "And we petitioned the territorial governor for an investigation." "That's a lot to ask based on circumstantial evidence," Warren said. "It's not circumstantial when you have photographs and chemical samples, and it's not a lot to ask when the alternative is letting Cordova pick us off one by one." The vote, when it came, was closer than Mara would have liked, but it passed. 23 in favor, 15 against, 7 abstaining. It was enough. Mara rode home that night exhausted but grimly satisfied. They had a coalition, they had evidence. And somewhere between here and Santa Fe, Elias was fighting the same battle from a different angle. All they had to do now was hold on. But as she approached the ranch in the darkness, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Lights. Multiple lights, moving around the property. Someone was waiting for her. Mara pulled her horse to a stop at the edge of the property, her heart hammering against her ribs. The lights weren't stationary. They were moving in a deliberate pattern, circling the house like predators sizing up prey. She counted at least 5 separate sources. Too many to be friendly visitors, too organized to be drifters. Her first instinct was to turn around, ride back to the garrets, and get help. But something stopped her. This was her home now, her land, and she'd be damned if she'd let anyone chase her away from it. She dismounted quietly, tied her horse to a scrub oak well back from the house, and approached on foot. The moon was bright enough to navigate by, but she stayed low, using the rocks and brush for cover. As she got closer, she could make out voices. Men's voices, rough and irritated. "Troy told us to wait inside, not stand around like idiots. House is locked. What do you want me to do, break the door down?" "That's exactly what Sutton said not to do. We're supposed to look like we were invited in." Mara's breath caught. Sutton. So Cordova had sent people to wait for her. The question was why. She circled around to the back of the house, where the kitchen door had a lock that barely worked. If they hadn't tried that entrance yet, she might be able to slip inside and what? She was one woman against 5 men, at least. Even if she got inside, she'd be trapped. "Think," she told herself. "Think like someone who spent years surviving impossible situations." The barn, or what was left of it, sat dark and skeletal against the night sky. But the tool shed next to it was intact. If she could reach it without being seen, she could arm herself. Maybe find something that would even the odds. She moved carefully, using the moonlight shadows to stay hidden. The men were focused on the front of the house, their lanterns creating pools of light that actually made the darkness around them deeper. It was a rookie mistake, one Mara was grateful for. The tool shed door creaked when she opened it, and Mara froze, waiting for shouts. None came. Inside, she found what she was looking for, Elias's rifle, the one he'd left behind because he was traveling fast and light. It was loaded, though Mara had only fired a gun a handful of times in her life and never at a person. She also grabbed a length of chain and a hammer, shoving them into her belt. Not much, but better than nothing. Armed, she moved back toward the house, this time with more confidence. She needed to see their faces, figure out who exactly Cordova had sent. If she could identify them, it would be more evidence for Elias to take to the federal office. She was crouched behind a water trough, trying to get a better angle on the men near the porch, when a hand clamped over her mouth and an arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward. Mara's training from years of dealing with drunk cowboys in her father's saloon kicked in. She drove her elbow back hard, connected with something soft, and heard a grunt of pain. The grip loosened enough for her to twist free and bring the rifle up. "Easy." The voice was familiar. "It's me. It's John Garrett." Mara lowered the rifle with shaking hands. John was doubled over, one hand pressed to his stomach where she'd elbowed him. "What are you doing here?" she hissed. "Helen sent me to check on you, saw the lights, and figured you'd do something stupid like try to handle this alone." He straightened, wincing. "Guess I was right. There are 5 of them. 6. One's watching the road from that rise over there." John nodded toward a distant hill. "They're waiting for you to come home." "I gathered that. What's the plan?" "My plan was to get you out of here before they see you." "That's not a plan. That's running away. Sometimes running away is the smart choice. And sometimes it's just postponing the inevitable." Mara checked the rifle's chamber, making sure it was ready to fire. "They're not going to stop. Tonight, tomorrow, next week, they'll keep coming until we either sell or they find a way to force us out." "So what do you want to do? Shoot them?" "I want to find out what they're planning, and I want evidence." John stared at her like she'd grown a second head. "You're serious? Completely? Elias is going to kill me if I let you do this." "Elias isn't here. I am." Mara met his eyes. "I need to know what we're up against, John. And right now they're standing around talking about it. All we have to do is listen." John was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "You're as stubborn as he is. Fine. But we do this smart. Stay low, stay quiet, and if things go wrong, we run. Agreed?" "Agreed." They moved closer to the house, using the shadows and the men's own lantern light against them. Mara could see them more clearly now. Rough-looking characters, the kind who got hired for jobs that required muscle and moral flexibility. One of them was pacing the porch, clearly agitated. "This is taking too long. What if she doesn't come back tonight?" "Then we wait until she does." The speaker was older, with a scar running down his cheek. He seemed to be in charge. "Sutton wants this handled quiet. That means we wait for the woman to show up, deliver the message, and leave. No drama." "What message?" "That her husband had an accident on the road to Santa Fe. Terrible tragedy. Horse threw him, broke his neck. By the time anyone finds the body, there won't be much to identify." Mara's blood turned to ice. "Sutton really went that far?" one of the other men asked, sounding uneasy. "Murder? Brooke's not dead. Yet. But he will be if his wife doesn't sign the sale papers we brought with us." The scarred man pulled out a document. "She signs, we send word to our friends on the Santa Fe road to leave her husband alone. She doesn't sign." He shrugged. "Well, accidents happen." Mara felt John's hand on her arm, squeezing tight, warning her to stay still, stay quiet. But her mind was racing. They had people waiting for Elias. He was riding into a trap, and there was no way to warn him, unless she gave Cordova what they wanted. "I need to hear the rest," she whispered to John. "You've heard enough?" "No, I need to know exactly what they're planning. Details, times, everything." They listened for another 10 minutes as the men grumbled and argued about their orders. Mara learned that Sutton had paid the territorial marshal to look the other way, that the accident for Elias was scheduled to happen tomorrow night, 2 days out from Santa Fe, in a canyon where bodies had been known to disappear, that if Mara signed the papers, she'd receive $50,000 and safe passage out of the territory. And if she didn't sign, they had orders to make sure the ranch burned down with her inside it. "I've heard enough," Mara whispered. "Let's go." They retreated carefully, making it back to where they'd left the horses without being spotted. Only when they were a mile away did Mara allow herself to process what she'd learned. Elias was going to die unless she did something. Tonight. "The Santa Fe Road," she said to John. "How many routes are there?" 3 main ones. Northern route through the mountains, middle route through the plains, southern route along the river valley. "Which would Elias take?" "Middle route. It's fastest." "And where's this canyon they mentioned? The one where they're planning the ambush?" John's face was grim. Devil's Jaw. It's a narrow pass about 2 days northeast of here, only way through that section of country unless you want to add a week to your journey. Could someone make it there before Elias does? Not unless they left right now and rode through the night, and even then, it'd be close. He paused. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I need to warn him. Mara, you can't ride to Devil's Jaw alone. That's rough country, and you'd be exhausted by the time you got there. So I'd better start now. This is insane. Let me go. You have a family, John. Helen needs you. Your boys need you. Mara checked her supplies, calculating what she'd need. I don't have anyone depending on me except Elias, and he's depending on me to keep him alive. He's depending on you to hold things together here. The ranch doesn't matter if he's dead. John opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. You really care about him, don't you? Mara didn't answer. She didn't have time to examine what she felt about Elias, didn't have the luxury of figuring out when he'd stopped being a stranger and started being someone she'd risk her life to save. I need the fastest horse you have, she said instead, and supplies for a 2-day hard ride. Can you do that? John stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Helen's going to kill me. But yes. They rode to the Garrett Ranch, where Helen took one look at Mara's face and started packing supplies without asking questions. Within an hour, Mara was mounted on their best horse, a rangy gelding named Striker, who'd been bred for endurance, with saddlebags full of food, water, and ammunition. You know how to get there? Helen asked. John drew me a map. It's not going to be easy. That country is unforgiving. I know. Helen reached up and squeezed Mara's hand. Bring him back. Both of you. Mara rode out into the darkness, pushing Striker hard but not recklessly. She had to balance speed with the horse's ability to maintain the pace for 2 solid days. Too fast, and they'd both collapse before reaching Devil's Jaw. Too slow, and Elias would ride into the ambush before she could warn him. The first night was the worst. Mara rode through terrain she barely knew, following John's map by moonlight and instinct. Twice she took wrong turns and had to backtrack. Once, Striker stumbled on loose rock and Mara's heart stopped, certain the horse had broken a leg. But he recovered, and they pushed on. By dawn, she was exhausted and disoriented. She stopped to rest the horse and eat something, but couldn't keep the food down. Her stomach was in knots, her mind spinning through scenarios that all ended badly. What if she was too late? What if Elias had already been killed? What if she got lost and never found the canyon at all? She forced the thoughts down and kept riding. The landscape changed as she traveled northeast. The scrubland gave way to rockier terrain, with mesas rising like ancient sentinels. The air grew thinner, colder. Mara's lips cracked, and her face felt sandblasted by the constant wind. She rode through the second day in a haze of exhaustion and determination. Striker was flagging, and she knew she was pushing him too hard, but there was no choice. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to Elias reaching the ambush point. She reached Devil's Jaw just as the sun was setting on the second day. The canyon was exactly as John had described, a narrow passage between towering rock walls, with barely enough room for a wagon to pass through. Perfect for an ambush, perfect for murder. Mara dismounted on shaking legs and led Striker into a small depression out of sight of the main trail. She gave him water and loosened his saddle, then grabbed the rifle and climbed to higher ground. From her vantage point, she could see the entire length of the canyon, and there, waiting in positions that gave them clear shots at anyone passing through, were 3 men. Cordova's killers, right where they said they'd be. Mara's hands were shaking so badly she had to set the rifle down. She'd made it. She'd actually made it in time. But now what? She was one exhausted woman with a rifle she barely knew how to use, facing 3 professional killers. Even if she could somehow warn Elias before he entered the canyon, they'd just reschedule the ambush for another time, another place. Unless she gave them a reason not to. The idea that formed in Mara's mind was either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both. But it was the only thing she could think of that might work. She waited until full dark, then made her way down into the canyon on foot. The men had made camp near the far end, confident that no one would approach them from behind. They had a small fire going and were passing a bottle between them. Mara got as close as she dared, then fired the rifle into the air. The men scrambled for their weapons, shouting and confused. Mara fired again, this time putting a bullet into their campfire and scattering sparks everywhere. "Next shot goes into one of you," she shouted, trying to make her voice carry and sound more confident than she felt. "Drop your weapons." "Who the hell?" I said, "Drop them. Now!" There was a moment of frozen confusion. Then one of the men, the youngest, from what Mara could see, slowly set down his rifle. "Smart," Mara called out. "The rest of you do the same." "There's only one of her," another man said. "She can't get all of us." Mara put a bullet into the ground at his feet. "Want to test that theory?" Slowly, reluctantly, they disarmed. "Now back away from the weapons, 10 paces. They did, and Mara moved forward quickly, scooping up their rifles and kicking them further into the darkness. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. "Sit down, hands where I can see them." "You're making a big mistake, lady. The mistake was yours. You really thought you could murder a man on a public road and get away with it? We don't know what you're talking about." Devil's Jaw, Elias Rook. Ring any bells? Mara moved closer, keeping the rifle trained on them. "I know exactly what you were hired to do, and I have witnesses back in the territory who heard your friends discussing it. You're already finished. The only question is whether you hang for attempted murder or just intimidation." The men exchanged looks. The youngest one spoke up. "Sutton promised us this was legal, said he had the marshal's approval. The marshal is corrupt, and Sutton lied to you." Mara let that sink in. "But here's the thing, I'm not interested in you. I'm interested in the man who hired you. You testify against Sutton and Cordova Mining, tell the federal investigators everything, and maybe you walk away from this." "Federal investigators?" "They're already looking into Cordova's operations. Water contamination, land fraud, all of it. Your testimony would seal the case." Mara was improvising now, hoping Elias had actually managed to get someone in Santa Fe to care. "Or you can stay loyal to a man who is willing to make you accessories to murder. Your choice." The men were silent. Then the youngest spoke again. "If we testify, what happens to us?" "That's up to the investigators, but I'd guess cooperation beats hanging." More silence. Then one of the older men spat into the dirt. "This job was supposed to be easy money. Sutton said it was just intimidation. Nothing serious." "Killing someone is pretty serious." "We weren't actually going to kill him, just scare him. Make it look bad enough that his wife would sign the papers." Mara felt cold. "That's still attempted murder." "Yeah, well, nobody told us the wife would be crazy enough to ride out here alone and get the drop on us. Crazy or desperate, sometimes there's not much difference." Mara took a breath. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write down everything. Who hired you, what you were told to do, how much you were paid, every detail. Then you're going to ride with me back to the territorial office and make that statement official. And if we refuse, then I shoot you and tell the authorities I caught you trying to kill my husband. Self-defense. I doubt anyone would question it given the circumstances." She was bluffing. Mara wasn't sure she could actually pull the trigger on an unarmed man. But they didn't know that. And her voice was steady enough to be convincing. The youngest man stood slowly. "I'll write it down. I'm not dying for Richard Sutton." The others grumbled but eventually agreed. Mara made them write their confessions by firelight, keeping the rifle trained on them the whole time. Her arms were shaking from exhaustion by the time they finished, but she didn't lower the weapon. "Now what?" one of them asked. "Now we wait for my husband to arrive, and when he does, you're going to tell him everything in person." Elias arrived at Devil's Jaw just after dawn, riding hard and looking like he'd pushed himself as relentlessly as Mara had pushed herself. He pulled up short when he saw the scene. Mara sitting on a rock with a rifle across her lap, 3 men bound with their own rope and looking miserable. "Mara?" He dismounted slowly, his scarred face showing more emotion than she'd ever seen. "What in the name of... how are you here?" "Long story, short version. Cordova sent men to the ranch to blackmail me into signing sale papers by threatening to have you killed. I rode out to warn you and caught these 3 waiting to spring the ambush." Elias stared at her, then at the bound men, then back at her. "You rode 2 days alone through country you don't know to stop an ambush?" "Yes. You could have been killed." "So could you. That seemed worse." Something shifted in his expression. He crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her to her feet, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You're insane," he said. Probably. You could have sent John Garrett, or John has a family, and this was my choice to make. Elias stared at her for a long moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, his face pressed against her hair. "Thank you," he said roughly. "Thank you for being too stubborn to let me die." Mara stood stiff in his arms for a moment, then slowly relaxed into the embrace. It felt strange and right all at once. They stood there for a long moment before Elias released her and turned to the bound men. "So who do we have here?" Mara introduced them and explained what they'd confessed to. Elias read through their written statements, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is enough," he said finally. "Combined with what I filed in Santa Fe, this should be enough to bring federal charges." "You actually got someone to listen?" "I got 3 someones to listen. Took me 2 days of arguing, but the federal land office is sending investigators. Should be here within the week." He looked at the bound men. "And now we have witnesses who can testify to direct criminal conspiracy. What do we do with them?" "We take them to the territorial marshal first. If he's corrupt like they say, we'll document his refusal to act. That's more evidence. Then we wait for the federal investigators to arrive." The ride back took 3 days. Mara and Elias traveled with their 3 prisoners in tow, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The men weren't happy about it, but they were smart enough to realize that cooperation was their best chance at avoiding the gallows. The territorial marshal, a man named Clayton, turned out to be exactly as useless as predicted. He listened to their story with a bored expression and said he'd look into it, while making it clear he had no intention of doing so. "That's what I expected," Elias said as they left the marshal's office. "But now we have documentation of his refusal to act. More ammunition for the federal case." They reached the ranch on the 4th day. The property looked the same, still scarred by fire, still struggling to survive. But something about it felt different to Mara. More like home and less like exile. Helen and John Garrett were waiting for them, along with what looked like half the ranchers in the territory. "We heard about the ambush," Helen said, pulling Mara into a hug. "John told everyone what you did. Word spread fast." "What are they all doing here?" "Standing guard. Making sure Cordova doesn't try anything else while you were gone." Helen's voice was fierce. "You organized us, Mara. Made us see we're stronger together. So we decided to prove it." Thomas Warren stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. "I owe you an apology. You were right about Cordova, and I was wrong to doubt you." Mara studied the man who'd called her irrational and foolish. "Apology accepted. Assuming you're willing to testify when the federal investigators arrive." "I am. We all are." He gestured to the assembled ranchers. "We're done being pushed around." The federal investigators arrived 6 days later, 3 serious men in suits who spent a week interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, and building their case. The confessions from Cordova's hired men were damning. The photographic evidence of water contamination was undeniable, and the sheer number of ranchers willing to testify to intimidation and illegal pressure created a pattern that even the most skeptical investigator couldn't ignore. Richard Sutton was arrested on a Monday morning, dragged out of his hotel room in handcuffs while trying to destroy documents. The charges included conspiracy to commit murder, environmental contamination, fraud in land acquisition, and bribery of public officials. The territorial marshal was arrested the same day. Cordova Mining's operations were suspended pending a full investigation. Their assets in the territory were frozen, and the federal office made it clear that any attempt to continue pressuring local landowners would result in additional charges. It was over. Against all odds, they'd won. Mara stood on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over land that was still harsh and unforgiving, but undeniably hers. Elias joined her, 2 cups of terrible coffee in his hands. "We did it," he said, handing her a cup. "Yeah, we did. The ranch is safe, the water rights are secure, Cordova is finished. For now." "You're not satisfied?" "I'm satisfied. I'm just—" Mara searched for the right words. "I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. It feels too easy." "Easy?" Elias laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "You rode 2 days through brutal country to stop an ambush. You organized a coalition of stubborn ranchers. You caught 3 killers single-handedly. Nothing about this was easy." "I suppose not." They stood in comfortable silence, drinking bad coffee and watching the light fade. Finally, Elias spoke. I need to tell you something. Mara's stomach tightened. What? When I was riding to Santa Fe, not knowing if I'd make it back, all I could think about was you here alone, trying to hold everything together. He set down his cup, and I realized something. This stopped being just a legal arrangement somewhere along the way. For me, at least. Mara's heart was hammering. Elias, I'm not asking for anything. I know the terms of our agreement. No romantic expectations, that's what we said. He finally looked at her. But I need you to know that you matter to me. Not as a convenient partner or a business arrangement, as a person, as someone I... He stopped, struggling with words. As someone I care about, deeply. Mara set down her own cup before she could drop it. When I heard those men talking about killing you, I felt something break inside me. And when I rode out to find you, it wasn't because of the ranch or the legal partnership. It was because the thought of you dying made me realize I couldn't breathe. Elias went very still. Mara, I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's love or just two broken people finding each other. But I know I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to step back. She didn't. When he cupped her face in his scarred hands, she leaned into the touch. I choose you too, he said quietly. I choose this life, this land, this future we're building together. When he kissed her, it was gentle and careful, like he was afraid she might disappear. Mara kissed him back and thought about all the things she'd been told she'd never have. A partner who saw her, a home that was hers, a life that mattered. She'd found all of them in the last place she'd expected, in a harsh territory with a damaged man, building something real from broken pieces. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was theirs. And that was more than enough. The months that followed weren't easy, but they were honest in a way Mara had never experienced before. The ranch demanded everything they had. Long days mending what Cordova had destroyed, longer nights planning how to make the operation actually profitable. But for the first time in her life, Mara was working for something that belonged to her. The federal investigation dragged on through the fall, each week bringing new revelations about Cordova Mining's operations. Turned out the company had been systematically poisoning water sources across 3 territories, buying up distressed properties for pennies on the dollar, then reselling them to larger mining conglomerates at enormous profit. Sutton and 6 of his associates were facing federal charges that would likely put them away for decades. Good, Elias said when the final indictments came through. He was sitting at the kitchen table, working on the ledgers while Mara prepared dinner. They deserve worse. They'll get worse. Prison out here isn't exactly comfortable. Still not enough for what they did to people. His jaw tightened, to Martha. It was the first time he'd mentioned his first wife since the night he'd told Mara about the fire. Mara set down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables and moved to stand beside him. You think Cordova was involved in her death? I don't know. The timing was wrong. This was 5 years ago, before Cordova even started operations in this territory. But someone barred that door from the outside. Someone wanted her dead. His scarred hands clenched. I may never know who. Does it matter anymore? He looked up at her, surprised. How can it not matter? Because knowing won't bring her back. It won't change what happened, and it won't change who you are now. Mara touched his shoulder gently. Martha's gone, Elias. But you're still here. We're still here. And maybe the best way to honor her memory is to build something good from all this wreckage. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he covered her hand with his own. When did you get so wise? I'm not wise. I'm just tired of letting the past control everything. She squeezed his shoulder. We both spent too long being defined by what was done to us. Maybe it's time to start being defined by what we choose to do. He pulled her down onto his lap, and she went willingly, resting her head against his shoulder. They sat like that for a while, finding comfort in simple closeness. I want to rebuild the barn, Elias said eventually. Do it right this time. Make it bigger, better equipped. That'll take money we don't have. We will have it. The federal office is offering compensation to everyone who suffered losses because of Cordova's activities. Between that and the copper deposits we now know are on our land. He paused. We could actually make this place profitable, Mara. Really profitable. You want to mine the copper ourselves? Hell no. But we could lease the mineral rights to a legitimate company, one that doesn't poison water and intimidate people. Use that income to build up the cattle operation, maybe expand into horses. His voice gained enthusiasm. We could make this ranch into something that lasts. Mara felt a flicker of hope. You really think so? I know so, but I can't do it alone. He met her eyes. I need a partner. A real partner. Someone who'll call me out when I'm being stubborn, who'll fight for this place as hard as I do, I'm already your partner. I know, but I want to make it official. Not just legally, but... He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I want to do this right. Inside the box was a ring. Not fancy. Just a simple silver band with a small stone that caught the lamplight. But it was chosen, not inherited. Meant for her specifically. I bought it in Santa Fe, Elias said, before everything went crazy. I was going to wait for the right moment, but then I realized every moment with you is the right moment. Mara's throat tightened. We're already married. We had a legal transaction. I want a real marriage. One where we both choose to stay, not because we're trapped or desperate, but because we want to build a life together. He took the ring from the box. So I'm asking. Will you marry me, Mara? For real this time. She looked at the ring, at his scarred face, at the hope and vulnerability in his winter sky eyes, and she thought about the girl who'd left Ridgeway months ago, invisible, used up, convinced she was worth nothing. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who'd organized ranchers, stopped an ambush, and fought for land that nobody else thought was worth saving. A woman who'd found her voice in the middle of nowhere and discovered she had more strength than she'd ever imagined. Yes, she said, I'll marry you. The kiss that followed was different from their first. Less tentative, more certain. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. We should do it properly this time, Mara said. Not just a magistrate and a witness. Actually celebrate. You want a wedding? Here? Why not? This land has seen enough violence and struggle. Maybe it's time for something good. They planned it for the first week of December, giving themselves enough time to rebuild what needed rebuilding and invite the people who'd stood by them. Helen Garrett insisted on organizing most of it, claiming that Mara had enough to worry about without adding wedding logistics. Besides, Helen said, surveying Mara with a critical eye, you need a proper dress. That gray thing you're always wearing is depressing. It's practical. It's ugly. Come on, we're going to town. The town was a 3-hour ride, and Mara spent most of it trying to convince Helen that a new dress was an unnecessary expense. But Helen was relentless, and eventually Mara found herself standing in a small shop while a seamstress with pins in her mouth circled her like a predator. You're built lean, the seamstress observed. Not much to work with in the chest, but we can emphasize your shoulders, create a nice line down to the waist. I don't need fancy, Mara protested. Honey, every woman needs at least one fancy dress in her life, especially when she's marrying a man she actually loves. The dress, when it was finished a week later, was simple but beautiful. Deep blue fabric that Helen said matched Mara's eyes, with long sleeves and a neckline that showed her collarbones without being scandalous. When Mara tried it on, she barely recognized herself. See, Helen said triumphantly, you clean up nice. I look ridiculous. You look happy. There's a difference. Mara studied her reflection. Helen was right. There was something different about her face. The hard lines had softened slightly. The defensive set to her shoulders had eased. She looked like someone who'd found a place to rest. The wedding was held on a Saturday morning, clear and cold, with the kind of sky that seemed to go on forever. They'd rebuilt enough of the barn to host everyone inside, out of the wind. Someone had hung lanterns from the beams, and Helen had somehow convinced several ranchers' wives to bring food. Nearly the entire territory showed up, not just out of obligation, but because Mara and Elias had become symbols of something. Resistance against corruption, the possibility of building something real in brutal country, proof that broken people could still find each other and make something whole. William Hayes, the elderly rancher who'd known Martha, agreed to officiate. He stood before them with a worn book in his hands and a kind expression on his weathered face. We're gathered here, he began, not to create a marriage. These two have already proven they're partners in every way that counts. We're here to witness them choosing each other. Again, deliberately, with full knowledge of what that choice means. Elias stood beside Mara in his best shirt, the scars on his face and neck visible, no longer something he tried to hide. Mara wore her blue dress and carried a handful of wildflowers that Helen had somehow found blooming despite the season. Elias, Hayes said, "Do you choose this woman? Knowing her stubbornness, her fierce independence, her refusal to be anything but exactly who she is." "I do," Elias said. "I choose all of it." "Mara, do you choose this man, knowing his grief, his scars, his tendency to work himself into the ground rather than ask for help?" "I do," Mara said. "I choose all of it." "Then speak your promises to each other." Elias took both of Mara's hands in his. "I promise to see you, not just look at you, but really see you, your strength, your worth, everything you are. I promise to never make you feel invisible. And I promise to build a life with you that's worth all the fighting it took to get here." Mara's voice was steady, despite the tears threatening to spill. "I promise to stand with you, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. I promise to fight for this land, this life, this partnership we're building. And I promise to remind you every single day that you're worth more than your scars and your grief." Hayes smiled. "Then by the authority vested in me by common sense and the fact that I'm the oldest person here, I declare you husband and wife. Again. For real this time." The barn erupted in applause and cheers. Elias kissed Mara thoroughly, and when they pulled apart, both of them were grinning. The celebration lasted well into the evening. People ate, drank, and shared stories. Thomas Warren cornered Mara at one point, looking uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize again," he said, "for how I treated you at that first meeting. You showed more spine than most men I know." "Apology accepted. Again." "Also wanted to say, if you ever need anything, you've got allies now, real ones." He cleared his throat. "You earned that." After he left, Elias appeared at Mara's elbow. Warren apologizing twice? That might be a first. People can change. Speaking of change, Elias gestured toward the door, where a figure had just entered. "We have a late arrival." Mara turned and saw a woman in travel-worn clothes, maybe 35, with dark hair and cautious eyes. She was holding the hand of a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, who had Elias's same winter sky eyes. Elias went completely still. "Sarah?" The little girl's face lit up. "Papa?" Everything else faded away. The girl, Sarah, released her mother's hand and ran across the barn, and Elias dropped to his knees just in time to catch her. He held her like she might disappear, his scarred hands shaking. "I thought you were dead," he said hoarsely. "They told me you were dead. Mama said we had to hide, said bad men were looking for us." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "Are the bad men gone now?" "Yeah, sweetheart, the bad men are gone." The woman approached slowly. Up close, Mara could see the resemblance. This was Martha's sister. Had to be. "I'm Catherine," she said quietly. "Martha's sister. I've been hiding Sarah since the fire. Martha got her out before—" She stopped. "I'm sorry I didn't contact you sooner, but I didn't know if it was safe." "You kept her alive," Elias said, still holding Sarah. "That's all that matters. I heard about what happened with Cordova Mining, that you'd brought them down, and I thought—" Catherine's voice broke. "I thought maybe it was finally safe to bring her home." Mara stepped forward. "You thought right. It's safe now." Catherine looked at her, assessing. "You're the new wife." "I'm Mara. Martha would have liked you, I think. She always said this land needed someone stubborn enough to survive it." Catherine managed a small smile. "Looks like Elias found her." The celebration shifted to accommodate the new arrivals. Sarah, initially shy, gradually warmed up as she realized these were friendly people. She stayed close to Elias, though, watching him with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "You got hurt," she said, touching his scarred cheek gently. "Yeah, I did." "Does it still hurt?" "Sometimes, but it's getting better. Mama said you were the bravest person she knew. She said you'd always protect me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I missed you, Papa." "I missed you too, sweetheart." every single day. Mara watched them from across the barn, her heart full. Helen appeared beside her with 2 cups of wine. "That's quite a wedding gift," Helen observed. "It really is. You going to be all right with this?" Instant motherhood is a lot to take on. Mara thought about it. She'd come to this territory looking for escape and found purpose. She'd married a stranger and found a partner. She'd fought for land that most people considered worthless and discovered it was worth everything. And now she had a chance to help raise a child who'd lost her mother, but not her father, to give Sarah the kind of home Mara had never had, one where she was seen, valued, chosen. "Yeah," Mara said. "I'm going to be all right with it." Later that night, after most of the guests had left, the 3 of them, Elias, Mara, and Sarah, stood on the porch looking out at the dark landscape. Catherine had agreed to stay in the area, giving Sarah stability while she adjusted to being back with her father. "It's really dark here," Sarah said. "Darker than the city." "That's because there's no other lights for miles," Elias explained. "Just us and the stars." "I like the stars." "Me too." Sarah looked up at Mara. "Are you going to be my new mama?" The question hit Mara like a physical blow. She knelt down so she was at Sarah's level. "I can't replace your mama. She loved you, and she died trying to keep you safe. That's something nobody can replace." "But could you be something else? Like a mama, but different?" Mara glanced at Elias, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that. If you'd like that." Sarah considered this seriously. Then she nodded. "Okay, but I'm going to call you Mara, not Mama. Is that all right?" "That's perfect." "And you'll teach me things? Like how to be brave like you?" "I'll try. Though I think you're already pretty brave." "I am?" "You survived something terrible, and you're still standing. That's the definition of brave." Sarah smiled, then yawned hugely. "I'm tired." Elias picked her up. "Let's get you to bed. We set up a room for you. It's the one with the window facing east, so you can see the sunrise." As he carried Sarah inside, Mara lingered on the porch for a moment. The land stretched out before her, still harsh, still unforgiving, but no longer hostile. It was home now. Her home. She thought about the girl she'd been, invisible, erased, convinced she had nothing to offer, and she thought about all the things that girl had been wrong about. She'd been wrong about her worth, wrong about her strength, wrong about what was possible when you stopped accepting what you were given and started fighting for what you deserved. The door opened behind her. Elias emerged, having settled Sarah into bed. "She went right to sleep," he said, wrapping his arms around Mara from behind, probably exhausted from everything. "It's a lot for a little girl to process. It's a lot for anyone to process." He rested his chin on top of her head. "I keep thinking this is a dream, that I'll wake up and she'll be gone again." "She's not going anywhere. Neither am I." "I know, but after so many years of losing things," he tightened his hold, "it's hard to trust that good things can last. Then we'll learn together. How to trust. How to believe that we deserve this." Mara turned in his arms. "We've earned it, Elias. Every single piece of happiness we have now, we fought for and earned." He kissed her forehead. "When did you become such an optimist?" "I'm not an optimist. I'm a realist who's been given evidence that fighting back actually works sometimes." They stood on the porch together, 2 people who'd been broken by life, and somehow found a way to build something whole from the pieces. Behind them was a house that had survived fire and loss. Around them was land they'd defended against impossible odds. And inside, sleeping peacefully, was a child who represented hope and second chances. It wasn't perfect. The ranch still struggled. Money was tight, the land was still brutal, and survival was still earned inch by painful inch. But it was theirs, built by their own hands, defended by their own courage, claimed through their own refusal to disappear. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Sarah adjusted to ranch life with the resilience of children, asking endless questions and following Elias everywhere. Mara found herself stepping into a role she'd never expected. Not quite mother, not quite friend, but something in between that felt right. "Why do we fix the fence every day?" Sarah asked one morning, watching Mara repair a section that the wind had damaged overnight. "Because if we don't, the cattle get out. And if the cattle get out, we lose money. And if we lose money, we can't keep the ranch. That seems like a lot of work just to keep cows in one place. It is. But that's what owning something means. Being willing to work for it every day, even when it's hard. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she picked up a hammer. Can I help? You sure? It's not fun work. Nothing here is fun work, but you do it anyway. Mara laughed. That's true. All right, I'll show you how. They worked together in comfortable silence, Sarah's small hands learning the basic rhythm of repair. It struck Mara that this was what she'd wanted to give the girl, not protection from hardship, but the tools to handle it. The knowledge that work was worth doing even when it was difficult. As winter deepened, the compensation from the federal government finally arrived. It was less than they'd hoped, but more than they'd feared. Enough to rebuild the barn properly, buy feed to get them through the cold months, and still have something left over for emergencies. We should put some aside, Mara said, reviewing the numbers, for Sarah's future, education, or whatever she needs. Martha would have wanted that, Elias agreed. She always believed education was the way out of poverty. It's not just about getting out anymore, though. It's about building something worth staying for. He looked at her with that expression that still made her breath catch. You've changed since you got here. You know that? We both have. No, I mean it. You arrived looking like you expected the world to hurt you at any moment. Now you look like you're ready to hurt it back if it tries. Mara considered this. I learned that from you. How to stand and fight instead of just enduring. And I learned from you how to live instead of just surviving. Fair trade. The ranch began to change as they poured the compensation money into repairs. The new barn was larger and better built, with proper storage for hay and equipment. They bought young stock to rebuild the herd, choosing animals bred for hardiness rather than just quantity. And slowly, painfully, the operation started to look less like a desperate struggle and more like an actual business. In March, a representative from Southwestern Mining, a legitimate company with actual environmental standards, approached them about leasing the copper rights. We've done geological surveys, the representative explained, spreading maps across their kitchen table. The deposits on your land are significant. We'd like to negotiate a lease that gives you a percentage of the profits while we handle all the extraction and processing. What about water contamination? Mara asked immediately. We use a closed-loop system. All chemicals are contained and recycled. We're required to test the groundwater monthly and report to federal regulators. The representative met her eyes. After what Cordova did in this territory, we're being extra careful. Bad publicity is expensive. They negotiated for 3 days, with Mara handling the business details while Elias focused on the environmental protections. The final agreement gave them 20% of the gross profits from any copper extracted, with strict penalties for any environmental damage. This could be enough to make the ranch truly sustainable, Elias said after the representative left with the signed contract. Between the cattle operation and the mineral lease, we might actually make it. We're going to make it. Spring brought challenges of a different kind. The monsoons came early and violent, turning the dry creek beds into raging torrents overnight. Mara woke one night to the sound of thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself. Flash flood, Elias said, already pulling on his boots. We need to move the cattle to higher ground. They worked through the night, riding in rain so heavy it was like being underwater, pushing frightened cattle toward the mesa where the ground rose above the floodplain. Sarah stayed with Catherine, safe in town, while Mara and Elias fought to save their herd. By dawn, they'd lost 10 head, swept away in the surge before they could be moved, but saved the rest. They stood on the mesa, soaked and exhausted, watching the water rage below. We need better drainage, Elias said. Channels to redirect the worst of the runoff. That'll cost money we don't have yet. The first mineral lease payment comes next month. We can do it then. Mara leaned against him, too tired to care that they were both dripping wet. Does it ever get easier? No, but we get stronger. The mineral lease payments started arriving in April, substantial amounts that transformed their financial situation overnight. Suddenly, they could afford not just repairs but improvements, better fencing, irrigation systems, even hired help during the busiest seasons. Thomas Warren stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss water rights, but really, Mara suspected, just to see how they were doing. You've done well for yourselves, he observed, looking around at the improvements. Better than most thought possible. We had help, Mara said. A lot of people stood by us when they didn't have to. And you stood by them first. That matters. Warren shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to ask, my youngest daughter, Amy, she's 16 and smart as hell. Too smart for ranch work, honestly. I was wondering if you might consider taking her on, teaching her bookkeeping, business management, that sort of thing. Mara was surprised. You want me to teach her? You're the only person in this territory who successfully negotiated with a mining company and came out ahead. Yeah, I want you to teach her. So Amy Warren became a regular presence at the ranch, learning how to keep ledgers and manage accounts, while Sarah watched with interest. Can I learn this too? Sarah asked one day. You're 7, Mara pointed out. Mama started teaching me numbers when I was 6. She said girls need to know business just as much as boys do. Your mama was right. Mara pulled out a slate. All right, let's start with basic arithmetic. Summer arrived with its characteristic heat, turning the land into something that shimmered and wavered in the harsh light. But this year, with irrigation systems in place and healthy cattle and steady income from the mineral lease, the season felt less like a siege and more like just another challenge to weather. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Sarah play with a kitten she'd found in the barn, Elias spoke quietly. I've been thinking about Martha a lot lately. Mara felt a flicker of something, not quite jealousy, but close. Why? Because I think I finally understand what happened, why she was killed. He looked at Mara. The timing was never right for Cordova, but I did some research. There was another mining company operating in this territory 5 years ago. Smaller operation, but just as ruthless. They wanted this land and Martha refused to sell. You think they killed her? I think they tried to scare us into selling by setting the fire. I think the barred door was meant to trap both of us inside, but I was gone on the cattle drive. Martha was the only one home. His jaw tightened. They killed her by accident, then covered it up and disappeared when their parent company went bankrupt a year later. Can you prove it? No, but I don't need to anymore. The company's gone, the people responsible are scattered or dead, and knowing doesn't change anything. He reached for Mara's hand. What matters is that we survived, that we built something good from the wreckage. Mara squeezed his hand. Martha would be proud of you, of what you've built, of how you're raising Sarah. I hope so. I hope she'd be glad that Sarah has you in her life. Even though I'm nothing like her? Especially because you're nothing like her. Sarah needs someone who'll teach her to be fierce and stubborn and unwilling to accept less than she deserves. Martha was gentle and kind. He smiled. You're a force of nature. Is that a compliment? The highest one I know. As summer faded into fall, the ranch hit a milestone, their first truly profitable quarter. The combination of cattle sales and mineral lease payments put them solidly in the black for the first time in years. We should celebrate, Elias said, looking at the ledger with something like wonder. How? I don't know. I've never had anything to celebrate before. They settled on a simple dinner, just the 3 of them, with food that wasn't strictly necessary but tasted good. Sarah chatted about the horse Elias had promised to teach her to ride. Mara and Elias exchanged glances over her head, both thinking the same thing. This was what they'd fought for. Not just survival, but the space to breathe, to enjoy small pleasures, to imagine futures that extended beyond the next crisis. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Mara and Elias sat on the porch in their usual spots. The land spread before them, dark and vast and no longer quite so threatening. Do you ever regret it? Elias asked. Answering that notice? Coming here? Mara thought about Ridgeway, about the saloon and her father and the life of invisible servitude she'd escaped. Not for a second. Even with everything that happened, the fire, the threats, almost dying in Devil's Jaw? Especially because of those things. They proved I was strong enough to survive anything. She looked at him. Do you regret it? Taking a chance on a stranger? I regret not doing it sooner. We could have had more time. We have time now. That's what matters. He pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence. In the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The land spoke its own language out here, harsh and beautiful and true. I've been thinking, Elias said eventually, about expanding, Not the ranch. Something else. What? Catherine mentioned that there are women in town, widows mostly, who need work. And there are ranches that need competent management but can't afford to hire experienced men. He paused. What if we created a kind of training program? Teach women ranch management, bookkeeping, business skills. Give them the tools to make themselves indispensable. Mara sat up, her mind racing. You want to create what I needed when I was in Ridgeway? Yeah, a way out for women who feel trapped, a way forward for those who are willing to work for it. That would require resources, space, teachers. We have the space. The barn is big enough to host classes, and you could teach bookkeeping and business. Catherine knows horsemanship and basic veterinary care. Helen Garrett could probably teach household management and preservation. The idea took root in Mara's mind, growing and expanding. We'd need funding. The territory offers grants for educational programs, and some of the ranchers who benefited from our fight against Cordova might be willing to contribute. They talked late into the night, planning and dreaming. By the time they finally went to bed, the foundation of something new had been laid. The program launched the following spring. They called it the Territorial Women's Agricultural Institute, though everyone just called it the Institute. The first class had 12 students, women ranging from 16 to 45, all looking for a way to build lives on their own terms. Mara taught business and bookkeeping. Catherine taught animal husbandry. Helen Garrett taught food preservation and household management. And Elias, to everyone's surprise, taught basic carpentry and equipment repair. Sarah, now 8, attended some of the classes, absorbing everything like a sponge. She's going to run this whole operation someday, Helen observed, watching Sarah help one of the older students with a particularly tricky math problem. I hope so, Mara said. She deserves that choice. The institute grew over the years, gaining recognition throughout the territory. Women came from hundreds of miles away to learn skills that would make them valuable, employable, independent. Some went on to manage ranches. Others started their own businesses. A few became teachers themselves, spreading the knowledge further. And through it all, the ranch continued, the land remained harsh. That never changed. But Mara and Elias had learned how to work with its brutality rather than against it. They'd learned which battles to fight and which to adapt to. They'd learned that survival wasn't about being unbreakable, but about knowing how to put yourself back together after you broke. 5 years after Mara first arrived, she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the land in impossible colors. Sarah was down at the barn, helping one of the institute students with a difficult horse. Elias was in town negotiating with a buyer for their cattle. She thought about the woman she'd been, invisible, erased, convinced she had nothing to offer the world. And she thought about the woman she'd become, scarred by her own battles, but stronger for them. A woman who'd learned that being seen wasn't about becoming what others wanted. It was about refusing to disappear until they had no choice but to acknowledge you. The door opened behind her. Elias emerged earlier than expected from his trip to town. How'd the negotiation go? She asked. Got top dollar. Buyer said our cattle are the healthiest he's seen in years. That's because we actually take care of them. Crazy concept. He wrapped his arms around her. You know what else is a crazy concept? What? That 5 years ago, I was alone in a house that felt like a tomb, convinced I'd never feel anything again. And now I'm married to the most stubborn woman in the territory, raising a daughter who's too smart for her own good, and running a program that's changing lives. Life's funny that way. It really is. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you. For what? For answering that notice. For being brave enough to choose this life. For teaching me that broken things can still be beautiful if you're willing to do the work. Mara turned in his arms. You taught me the same thing. They stood together as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, taking the day's heat with it. In the distance, Sarah's laughter rang out, clear and joyful. The land stretched around them, no longer an enemy but a partner in their ongoing survival. This was what they'd built. Not a perfect life, but an honest one. Not an easy existence, but one that mattered. Not a fairy tale ending, but something better. A beginning that kept expanding, kept offering new possibilities, kept proving that the most worthwhile things in life were worth fighting for. The invisible woman had finally been seen. The broken man had learned to hope again. And together, they'd created something that would outlast them both, proof that even in the harshest places, even from the most damaged beginnings, something good could grow if you refused to give up on it. That was the truth Mara had learned in this brutal, beautiful land. You didn't need to be perfect to deserve happiness. You didn't need to be undamaged to build something worthwhile. You just needed to be willing to fight for it, day after day, with whatever strength you had left. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone willing to fight beside you. Someone who saw your scars and your strength and loved you for both. Mara had found that person, had found this land, had found a life that was entirely, completely, fiercely hers. And that was more than enough. It was everything.